Under the gilded skyline of Los Angeles, where the city's wealth and ambition glimmered in every skyscraper, Ethan Hartford drove his meticulously polished Aston Martin DB11 down the winding roads of Beverly Hills. The car, a deep emerald green, mirrored his lifestyle, opulent, calculated, and designed for admiration. He adjusted his cobalt blue tie with one hand while gripping the steering wheel with the other, a ritualistic motion that showcased his precision. As he navigated through the early morning streets, the city gleamed under the first golden rays of sunlight, casting reflections of power and dreams against his windshield. Ethan's lips curled into a sardonic smile as a thought crossed his mind. Love begins with the eyes, doesn't it? And if not, can it even be real? It was a question that plagued him, a mantra he entertained to shield himself from vulnerability. His doubts about love hovered like a fog. What if love is merely a mirage, a flicker of desire that dissipates once the charm wears thin? These musings occupied him until something, or rather someone, broke through the monotony of his drive. Turning onto a quiet street lined with jacaranda trees in full bloom, he caught sight of a woman walking with an air of effortless grace. Her silhouette captivated him immediately. She wore a flowing sundress, her golden hair cascading down her back like streams of sunlight captured in silk. The morning breeze played with her locks, creating a visual symphony Ethan couldn't look away from. For the first time in a long while, his breath hitched. The Aston Martin's responsive braking system brought the car to a smooth halt, as though the machine itself recognized this encounter was meant to be savored. Ethan rolled down the window, just enough for his voice to carry, leaning slightly to project an air of polished casualness. "Excuse me," he called out with a practiced charm, his voice as smooth as the leather interior of his car. "I seem to be hopelessly lost. Could you help me find my way?" The woman hesitated before turning to him, her deep, thoughtful eyes locking with his. A flicker of curiosity crossed her face, coupled with the slightest hint of skepticism. "Lost? Where to?" she asked, her voice melodic yet grounded, carrying an air of quiet confidence. "Oak Avenue," he lied, without missing a beat. Ethan Hartford wasn't lost. He knew every corner of this city. But this wasn't about directions. Her lips curved into a polite smile, and she gestured down the street. 3 blocks that way, then left. As she turned to leave, Ethan seized the moment. "Wait," he said, leaning forward. "Would you let me drive you there? It would be easier than explaining my way around." For a moment she seemed to weigh the offer, her gaze flickering between him and the sleek car. Finally, with a shrug of indifference that masked her amusement, she agreed. Ethan quickly stepped out to open the passenger door for her, his heart racing in a way that startled him. "What's your name?" he asked as she settled into the plush seat. "Lila Montgomery," she replied, her voice steady, her gaze piercing. "I'm Ethan Hartford," he said, flashing a smile. "And I must say, Lila, you have the kind of hair that would make Rapunzel jealous." She laughed lightly, her mirth like the tinkling of wind chimes. "Is that your usual line?" "Only for women who look like they've stepped out of a fairy tale," he said, with unabashed sincerity. As they cruised down the avenue, Ethan couldn't help but steal glances at her, the sunlight catching the strands of her hair in a way that made it seem almost other-worldly. But beneath her striking beauty, there was an air of melancholy that intrigued him even more. "Where are you headed, Lila?" he asked casually. She hesitated briefly before answering. "An interview. Montgomery and Reed. I'm applying for a position as an executive assistant." Ethan smirked, trying to mask his surprise. "Is that so? Well, you might be interested to know that I own Montgomery and Reed." Lila raised a brow, her expression a mix of amusement and skepticism. "Then how is it you don't know where your own building is?" Ethan laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Caught me. Let's just say I'm not usually one for interviews. I leave that to HR, but I figured today was worth making an exception." As they reached the towering glass building of Montgomery and Reed, Ethan turned to her. "How about this? Skip the formalities and come work for me directly. My personal assistant position is open, and I promise you'll never need directions again." Lila tilted her head, a playful glint in her eye. "Is this how you usually recruit people?" "Only the ones with hair that deserves its own corner office," Ethan quipped, but his tone softened. "Think about it, Lila. I see something in you, and I don't mean just the hair." For a moment her gaze softened, her guard slipping, but then, just as quickly, it was back up. "Thank you for the ride," she said, stepping out of the car with a final smile that left Ethan watching her retreating figure long after she disappeared into the building. The following day, Lila arrived at the office, her professionalism evident in every step she took. She wore a tailored blazer, her golden hair neatly tied back, yet still radiant, catching the eyes of everyone she passed. From his office, Ethan watched her with intrigue. Something about her pulled at him. Not just her beauty, but the quiet determination she seemed to carry. When he approached her desk, he leaned casually against it. "How's the first day treating you?" he asked, his tone lighter than air. "Busy," she replied without looking up, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Good," he said, "because I'm expecting you to impress not just me, but every investor in the room tomorrow. Think you're up for it?" Lila paused, meeting his gaze directly. "Confidence is built on preparation, Mr. Hartford. I'll be ready." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by her unwavering poise. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated her, not just as an employee, but as a force of nature he was yet to fully comprehend. The next morning, the auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Investors, executives, and other key stakeholders filled the seats, their attention fixed on the upcoming presentation for Montgomery and Reed's new initiative. Ethan stood at the podium, his tailored suit exuding authority. After a brief introduction to set the tone, he turned to the audience with a flourish. "And now," he said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and showmanship, "I'd like to introduce someone whose insights and talents have already begun shaping our company's future. Please welcome Lila Montgomery." The room erupted in polite applause as Lila walked onto the stage. Dressed in an elegant navy suit that highlighted her commanding presence, she stood with a quiet confidence. Her hair, once the subject of Ethan's light-hearted admiration, now seemed like an emblem of her individuality, catching the spotlight in a way that enhanced her composure rather than overshadowed it. "Thank you, Mr. Hartford," Lila began, her voice clear and deliberate. "Our vision is not just about numbers or metrics. It's about people, empowering them, inspiring them, and ensuring that every product we create reflects our commitment to authenticity and innovation." As she delved into the company's strategy, she brought the audience through a seamless narrative. She highlighted plans to increase market presence, connect with diverse communities, and leverage personal stories to humanize the brand. Her delivery was poised, her insights razor-sharp, and her passion palpable. By the time she finished, the room was silent for a beat, absorbing the depth of her words before erupting into genuine applause. Ethan, standing off to the side, felt a mixture of pride and awe. As Lila stepped off the stage, he leaned in and murmured, "You just raised the bar for the rest of us, Montgomery." She smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with a quiet triumph. That evening, Montgomery and Reed hosted a gala at a luxurious Beverly Hills venue. The event was an opportunity to mingle with high-profile investors, including Karim Al-Farid, a discerning magnate known for his high standards and skepticism. Lila arrived in a sleek black gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her hair flowed freely, catching the light as if each strand were woven with gold. Ethan, already circulating among the guests, noticed her arrival immediately and excused himself from a conversation to greet her. "You clean up nicely," he remarked with a grin. "So do you," she replied, matching his tone. Before they could exchange more banter, Karim approached, his sharp gaze immediately fixing on Lila. "You're the one from the presentation this morning," he said, bypassing Ethan entirely. "Impressive." "Thank you," Leila replied, her tone measured but warm. "I appreciate the opportunity to share our vision." Karim narrowed his eyes slightly as if testing her. "Words are easy. Execution is harder. How can your company guarantee the promises you made today?" Without missing a beat, Leila replied, "By ensuring our actions speak louder than our words. We've already started by revising our supply chain to prioritize ethical sourcing and transparency. Additionally, our new initiative directly involves community feedback at every stage, from development to implementation. The proof of our commitment will be in the impact we make, not just the profits we earn." Karim studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I like your approach. Pragmatic, yet optimistic. That's rare." Ethan watched the exchange with a mix of admiration and pride. Leila had managed to capture Karim's attention and respect, something even he struggled to achieve. Later, as the evening wound down, Ethan found Leila on the balcony overlooking the city. The distant lights of Los Angeles sparkled like a sea of stars. "You're full of surprises," he said, joining her. She glanced at him, her expression softening. "And you thought I was just a pretty face with good hair?" Ethan chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'll admit, I underestimated you at first, but you've proven me wrong, again and again." There was a pause, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You have a way of seeing things that most people miss," he said, his tone more serious. "It's rare, and honestly, it's inspiring." Leila looked out at the city, her voice quieter when she responded. "When you've been through enough, you start to see the world differently. You learn to find strength in places most people don't even think to look." Ethan wanted to press her for more, to uncover the story behind her words, but something in her demeanor stopped him. Instead, he nodded. "Whatever it is, it's made you remarkable." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted at secrets and resilience. "Thank you, Ethan." Over the next weeks, Leila became an integral part of Montgomery and Reed. Her ideas not only elevated the company's profile, but also brought a sense of purpose to its mission. Investors were more confident, employees more inspired, and Ethan found himself thinking about her far more often than he intended. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a particularly grueling meeting, Ethan turned to Leila with a grin. "Have dinner with me tonight." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a request or an order?" "Neither," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "It's a proposition. I'd like to get to know you better, beyond the office." Leila hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right, but no business talk." "Deal," Ethan said, a smile spreading across his face. That evening marked the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated, a connection that went beyond appearances, beyond first impressions, and into the realm of shared dreams and mutual respect. For Leila, it was a chance to finally be seen for who she truly was, not just for how she looked. For Ethan, it was a revelation that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you pursue, but the ones that find you when you're least expecting it. And as the city lights flickered around them, both felt the quiet promise of a future yet to unfold. A story just beginning, written not in gold, but in authenticity and hope. The days following their dinner were marked by an unspoken shift between Ethan and Leila. They continued to work seamlessly as a team, but there was a new layer of understanding between them, a camaraderie that hinted at something deeper. Ethan, who had always been driven by results and reputation, found himself increasingly drawn to Leila's perspective. She had a way of grounding even the loftiest ambitions, turning them into actionable plans that resonated with the team and the investors alike. One afternoon, as they brainstormed for an upcoming campaign, Ethan leaned back in his chair watching Leila, as she sketched out ideas on the whiteboard. "You have this uncanny ability to simplify the complex," he said, breaking the silence. "It's like you're seeing things from a different altitude than the rest of us." Lila paused, marker in hand, and turned to face him. "Perspective comes from experience," she said simply. Ethan tilted his head. "And what kind of experience shaped yours?" She hesitated, her expression momentarily guarded. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. "I haven't always been this composed, you know," Lila said, a soft smile playing on her lips. "There was a time when I was trying so hard to be what everyone else expected, I completely lost sight of myself." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "I grew up in a small town," she continued. "Everyone knew everyone, and appearances mattered more than reality. My parents were well respected, and they had these dreams for me, dreams that didn't quite match who I was. For a while I tried to fit the mold, but it was like wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. It was exhausting." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "Eventually, I left. I needed to find out who I was when I wasn't trying to live up to someone else's expectations. It wasn't easy, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. But those mistakes taught me more about myself than any success ever could." Ethan watched her intently, his usual playful demeanor replaced by genuine attentiveness. "And now?" he asked. "Now," she said with a faint laugh, "I'm still learning. But I've realized that authenticity is worth the risk. Pretending to be someone you're not might keep you safe. But it also keeps you small, and I don't want to live a small life." Ethan felt a pang of recognition in her words. He too had spent much of his life playing a role, crafting a persona that exuded confidence and control, even when he felt anything but. "I get it," he said after a moment. "I think we all wear masks to some extent. The trick is knowing when to take them off." Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The next challenge came unexpectedly. A major client expressed doubts about the company's direction, threatening to pull out of a lucrative partnership. The news sent ripples of tension through the team, and even Ethan seemed unusually tense. As the team gathered in the boardroom to strategize, Lila took the lead. She presented a plan that not only addressed the client's concerns, but also proposed a bold, new approach to align the company's goals with theirs. Her confidence and clarity were contagious, and by the end of the meeting the team was energized and optimistic. Ethan pulled her aside afterward, his expression a mix of admiration and gratitude. "You saved us in there," he said. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Lila smiled. "You would have figured it out eventually, but I'm glad I could help." That evening, Ethan found himself standing outside Lila's office, hesitating. He had something to say, but the words felt heavy. Finally, he knocked. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside. Lila nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day. About living authentically," he began. It hit closer to home than I expected. She watched him silently, her expression encouraging. "I've spent so much of my life trying to prove something to my family, to the world, to myself. I've built this image of who I'm supposed to be, but lately I'm starting to wonder if it's who I really am." Lila's gaze softened. "It takes courage to ask those questions, Ethan. Most people spend their whole lives avoiding them." He exhaled, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You make it sound noble. It mostly feels terrifying." "It is," she said with a small laugh, "but it's also worth it." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared vulnerability filling the room. Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. They challenged each other, supported each other, and found a rhythm that made both their professional and personal lives richer. Ethan began to shed some of the armor he'd worn for so long, allowing himself to be more present and open. Lila, in turn, found a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was searching for. One evening, as they walked through the city after a particularly long day, Ethan turned to her. "You've changed me, you know?" Lila raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do anything you weren't ready to do yourself." "Maybe," he said, "but you showed me it was possible." They stopped at a small cafe, the hum of the city fading into the background as they talked late into the night. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he could breathe, and for the first time in years, Lila felt like she was truly seen. The rise of the sun over Manhattan painted the iconic skyline in hues of amber and gold, ushering in a crisp Saturday morning. The bustling city seemed momentarily still, as if holding its breath for what was to come. Jasmine Seraphine Ashcroft stood on the sprawling balcony of Ethan Hartford's penthouse, the distant hum of New York's energy a faint backdrop to the serenity of her thoughts. Dressed in a simple yet elegant cream blouse tucked into tailored white pants, her golden hair cascaded like liquid sunshine over her shoulders, catching the early light. She leaned lightly against the railing, letting the gentle morning breeze play with the strands of her hair as she sipped on her coffee. Ethan appeared moments later, his presence breaking the tranquility. But he wasn't alone. Cradled in his arms was a toddler with soft curls and bright, curious eyes. The child reached out for everything he could touch, a look of wonder permanently etched on his cherubic face. "Good morning," Ethan said with his signature smile, though there was an uncharacteristic softness in his tone. Jasmine's eyes lit up as she noticed the boy, a warmth spreading through her chest. She set her mug down and walked toward them, her movements graceful, yet filled with curiosity. "Who is this little charmer?" she asked, her voice lilting with affection. Ethan shifted the boy slightly in his arms and smiled down at him. "This is Matthew," he said simply, his voice filled with an emotion Jasmine couldn't quite place. The simplicity of his statement caught her off guard. "Matthew?" she repeated, her brows furrowing slightly as her gaze moved between the boy and Ethan. "Is he—" "Yes," Ethan interrupted gently, his gaze steady. "He's my son." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Jasmine's smile didn't falter, but her mind raced. She glanced at Matthew, his innocent face oblivious to the weight of the conversation. Her voice softened as she asked, "Will I have the chance to meet his mother?" Ethan chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "I doubt it," he said, shaking his head slightly. Jasmine tilted her head, her expression inviting him to elaborate. "She's not around," he admitted, a tinge of bitterness coloring his words. Before she could respond, Ethan continued, "Let's just say she wasn't interested in the long-term responsibilities of parenthood." Jasmine nodded, her gaze lingering on Matthew. She reached out, and the boy instinctively leaned toward her. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before gently placing him in her arms. Jasmine cradled him with practiced ease, her natural grace making it seem as though she had done this 1,000 times before. Matthew looked up at her, his tiny fingers brushing against the golden strands of her hair. "What a beautiful little boy," she said softly, her voice carrying a tenderness that made Ethan's chest tighten. Later that day, Jasmine found herself wandering along the private garden attached to Ethan's property. Matthew toddled ahead of her, giggling as he explored every flower and leaf in sight. Ethan watched from a distance, his hands in his pockets and his expression unreadable. When Jasmine finally turned to face him, her eyes held a question he knew was coming. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked gently. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to complicate things. You were just getting to know me. And Matthew, well, he's my world, but not everyone understands what that means." Jasmine's gaze softened. "I understand more than you think," she said. He looked at her, his defenses momentarily lowered. "Do you?" "I do," she affirmed, her voice steady. "Being a parent changes everything, and even if I'm not one myself, I can see how much he means to you." Ethan smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "He's the best thing that's ever happened to me," he admitted, "even if the way he came into my life wasn't ideal." Jasmine's curiosity deepened, but she didn't press him. Instead, she focused on Matthew, who was now attempting to pick a particularly stubborn flower. "He's lucky to have you," she said after a moment. Ethan's gaze softened as he watched her with Matthew. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost: hope. The following weekend, Ethan invited Jasmine and Matthew to a private beach house nestled along the Hamptons' pristine coastline. The house was a modern masterpiece of glass and wood, blending seamlessly with the surrounding dunes and the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretching beyond it. Jasmine arrived wearing a light sundress, her golden hair flowing freely in the salty breeze. Matthew, now more comfortable in her presence, toddled beside her, holding her hand as they approached the shoreline where Ethan waited. The sight of Ethan standing barefoot in the surf with his sleeves rolled up made Jasmine smile. It was a side of him she rarely saw, relaxed, almost boyish. "Finally decided to join us," he teased as they reached him. "We had to stop and admire the view," Jasmine retorted with a smirk, gesturing toward the sea. Ethan laughed, bending down to scoop Matthew into his arms. "And what do you think, buddy? Is this better than the city?" Matthew squealed in delight, pointing at the waves crashing against the shore. Jasmine watched them with a wistful expression, the scene stirring something deep within her. As the afternoon wore on, the three of them played in the surf. Ethan held Matthew aloft as the boy kicked his legs, giggling as the waves splashed around him. Jasmine stayed closer to the shore, letting the water lap at her ankles. She laughed as Ethan tried to coax her further in, but she shook her head, feigning indignation. "Do you have any idea how much time I spend taking care of my hair?" she joked, twisting a golden strand around her finger. Ethan grinned mischievously. "Come on, Seraphine. Live a little." "No way," she replied, crossing her arms. "The salt water will ruin it." Ethan let out a mock sigh of disappointment, but didn't press her further. Instead, he waded back toward her, Matthew still perched on his shoulders. "Fine," he said, his tone teasing, "but you're missing out." That evening, the three of them sat around a small bonfire on the beach. Matthew had fallen asleep in Jasmine's arms, his head nestled against her shoulder. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across their faces as the moonlight danced on the waves. Ethan watched Jasmine as she gently stroked Matthew's hair, her expression peaceful, yet thoughtful. "You're good with him," he said, his voice low but sincere. She glanced up, meeting his gaze. "He's a sweet boy," she replied. "It's easy to love him." Ethan hesitated, then added, "It's not just that. You have this way of making people feel safe. I've seen it with him, with the team at work, with me." Jasmine looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I think everyone deserves to feel safe," she said softly. "It's the least we can offer each other." There was a moment of silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice barely audible over the ocean's rhythm. "Jasmine, he began, but his words faltered. She looked at him expectantly, her heart pounding. "I'm glad you're here," he finally said, his gaze steady, but vulnerable. Jasmine smiled, her eyes glinting with unshed tears. "So am I." The next morning, as Jasmine prepared breakfast in the beach house's open kitchen, Ethan joined her, carrying Matthew on his hip. He set the boy down in his high chair before leaning casually against the counter. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone light but deliberate. "About?" Jasmine asked, without looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "About how much you've become a part of our lives," he said. "Matthew adores you, and honestly, so do I." Jasmine froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to face him, her expression cautious. "Ethan," she began, but he interrupted. "I know I'm not the easiest person to be around," he admitted, "and I know my life, our lives, are complicated. But I can't ignore how I feel about you. Jasmine bit her lip, her mind racing. I don't know if I'm ready, she said finally, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze intense but gentle. Ready for what? He asked softly. For this, she admitted. For us. For what it means to be part of your world. Ethan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're already a part of it, he said, whether you realize it or not. Jasmine closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them, she met his gaze with a newfound resolve. Then let's take it slow, she said. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Slow it is. Over the next few weeks, Jasmine found herself spending more and more time with Ethan and Matthew. Their dynamic evolved naturally, as though they had always been meant to exist in each other's orbits. Jasmine's presence brought warmth and stability to Ethan's life, while Matthew thrived under her attentive care. Yet beneath the surface, Jasmine wrestled with doubts she couldn't ignore. Ethan's life, though outwardly polished, was a mosaic of contradictions. He was devoted to Matthew, yet there were moments when his priorities seemed skewed, when his ambition and need for control cast long shadows over their blossoming connection. One evening, after a long day, Jasmine found herself sitting alone on the balcony of Ethan's penthouse. The city sparkled below her, but her thoughts were miles away. She didn't hear Ethan approach until he placed a glass of wine on the table beside her. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Jasmine hesitated, then sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if we're moving too fast," she admitted. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Do you want to slow down?" he asked, his tone free of judgment. "It's not that," she said quickly. I want to be sure we're building something real, something that will last." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I get it," he said. "And I want that too. But I also know that nothing in life comes with guarantees. We just have to trust that we're doing our best." Jasmine smiled faintly, his words resonating more than she expected. "Trust isn't always easy," she murmured. "I know," Ethan said, "but sometimes it's all we've got." Things took an unexpected turn one morning when Ethan received news that threatened to upend their carefully balanced lives. An investor who held significant sway over his company had expressed dissatisfaction with its recent direction, and their support was suddenly at risk. The news hit Ethan hard. Though he tried to maintain his composure, Jasmine could see the strain in his eyes. "We'll figure it out," she said reassuringly, as they discussed the situation over coffee. Ethan looked at her, his usual confidence replaced by doubt. "What if we don't?" "You will," Jasmine said firmly. "You always do." Her faith in him was unwavering, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this time might be different. Later that day, as he prepared for a critical meeting with the investor, Jasmine offered to join him. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. Ethan hesitated. "I appreciate it, but this isn't your fight." Jasmine crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "If it affects you, it affects me. We're in this together, remember?" Her words struck a chord in Ethan, and he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's do this." The meeting was held in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Ethan's headquarters. Jasmine sat beside him, her presence a silent source of strength. The investor, a shrewd man named Victor Langston, wasted no time laying out his grievances. "Your recent decisions have been unorthodox," he said, his tone sharp, "and frankly, I'm not convinced they're in the company's best interest." Ethan listened patiently, though Jasmine could see the tension in his jaw. When Victor finished, Ethan began to respond, his words measured but firm. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but the changes we've made are designed to position the company for long-term success, not just short-term gains." Victor raised an eyebrow. "And you're willing to risk alienating your investors to achieve that?" Before Ethan could reply, Jasmine spoke up. Sometimes the greatest risks yield the greatest reward, she said. Victor turned his attention to her, his expression skeptical. And you are? Someone who believes in this company and its potential, she said confidently. I've seen firsthand the impact of the changes Ethan has implemented, and I can tell you they're already making a difference. It's not just about profits, it's about creating something that lasts. Victor studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. You make a compelling case, he admitted. But words are cheap. I'll need to see results. You will, Ethan said, his confidence returning. And when you do, I think you'll agree it was worth the risk. After the meeting, Ethan and Jasmine returned to his office, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. You were incredible in there, Ethan said, his admiration evident. Jasmine shrugged modestly. I just said what needed to be said. No, Ethan said firmly, you said what I couldn't, and it made all the difference. Jasmine smiled, the warmth of his praise settling over her like a blanket. I guess we make a good team, she said. Ethan nodded, his gaze holding hers. The best, he said softly. To escape the mounting pressure at work, Ethan proposed a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin upstate. Jasmine hesitated at first, concerned about leaving her obligations behind. But Ethan's insistence and the promise of quality time with Matthew won her over. Nestled in the heart of a dense forest, the cabin was a rustic yet luxurious retreat. A crystal-clear lake stretched out before it, reflecting the surrounding pines and the blue expanse of the sky. Jasmine felt an immediate sense of calm as they arrived, the tranquility of the setting a stark contrast to the chaos of the city. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan built a fire in the stone hearth while Jasmine prepared dinner. Matthew toddled around the living room, his laughter filling the space with warmth. This place is magical, Jasmine said as she set the table. Ethan looked up from the fire, his expression softening. I thought you might like it, he said. Later, after Matthew had been put to bed, Ethan and Jasmine sat on the cabin's wraparound porch, sipping wine and gazing at the stars. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle rustling of the trees. It's beautiful here, Jasmine murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on her rather than the sky. It is, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't talking about the scenery. Jasmine felt her cheeks flush under his steady gaze. What? She asked, feigning innocence. Nothing, he said with a small smile. Just thinking about how lucky I am. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her reaction with a teasing smile. Don't get too sentimental on me, Hartford, she said. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Too late. The next morning, Jasmine woke early and stepped outside to find Ethan sitting on the dock, staring out at the lake. She joined him, the cool morning air sending a slight shiver down her spine. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Too much on my mind, he admitted. Want to talk about it? He hesitated, then sighed. It's just everything. The company, Matthew, us. Sometimes it feels like I'm juggling too many things at once, and I'm terrified I'll drop something important. Jasmine placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle, but grounding. You don't have to do it all alone, Ethan, she said. I'm here. We're in this together, remember? Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she rarely saw. I know, he said softly, and that's what scares me the most. What do you mean? He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the water. I'm scared of losing you, Jasmine, of messing this up. You and Matthew are the best things in my life, and the thought of not having you... He trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. Jasmine's heart ached at his confession. She reached out, cupping his face in her hands and forcing him to look at her. You're not going to lose me, she said firmly. But you have to trust me, Ethan. Trust that I'm here because I want to be, and that I'm not going anywhere. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I'm trying," he whispered. "That's all I ask," Jasmine said. By the time they returned to the city, the bond between Ethan and Jasmine had deepened. They moved through their days with a renewed sense of purpose, tackling challenges together and finding joy in the small moments they shared as a makeshift family. At work, the investor crisis began to resolve itself, thanks in large part to the plan Jasmine had helped craft. Ethan's confidence returned, and with it came a renewed determination to secure the company's future. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the office, Ethan surprised Jasmine with a home-cooked dinner. "You cooked?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as she entered his kitchen to find him surrounded by an impressive array of ingredients. "Don't sound so surprised," he said, feigning offense. "I'm a man of many talents," Jasmine laughed, shaking her head. "All right, Chef Hartford, let's see what you've got." The meal was simple but delicious, and by the time they finished, Jasmine couldn't stop smiling. "You've outdone yourself," she said as she helped him clear the table. Ethan grinned. "High praise coming from you." Jasmine rolled her eyes playfully. "Don't let it go to your head." As they washed the dishes side by side, Ethan suddenly turned to her, a serious expression on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Nothing," he said quickly. I need you to know how much you mean to me, Jasmine. You've changed my life in ways I didn't think were possible." Jasmine's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time she allowed herself to fully believe in the possibility of a future with him. "You mean a lot to me, too," she said, her voice soft but steady. Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "Then let's keep building this," he said. "Together?" Jasmine nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Together," she echoed. As Jasmine's relationship with Ethan deepened, so did her internal struggle. Though she cherished the bond they had built, a part of her remained haunted by the secrets she carried. She had spent years carefully crafting a confident exterior, one that shielded her from the judgment of a world obsessed with appearances. But as her connection with Ethan grew stronger, she knew it was only a matter of time before her truth would surface. One evening, as she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, Jasmine stared at her reflection. Her golden hair, long and radiant, framed her face like a crown. To anyone else, it was a symbol of beauty and femininity, but to Jasmine, it was a reminder of the facade she had built. Taking a deep breath, she reached up and removed the wig. Beneath it, her scalp was smooth and bare, the result of a battle she had fought and won years ago. Jasmine ran a hand over her head, her eyes filling with tears. The memory of her diagnosis, the grueling treatments, and the loss of her hair came flooding back, mingling with the fear of how Ethan might react when he learned the truth. "Enough," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "It's time." The next evening, Jasmine invited Ethan to her apartment for dinner. She spent the day preparing not just the meal, but also herself, rehearsing the words she needed to say. When Ethan arrived, he greeted her with his usual warmth, but Jasmine could tell he sensed something was different. "Everything okay?" he asked as they sat down to eat. Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. "There's something I need to talk to you about," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Ethan set down his fork, his expression serious. "I'm listening." Jasmine took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached up and removed her wig. She placed it gently on the table, meeting Ethan's gaze head-on. "This is me," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "The real me." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't speak. Jasmine could see the wheels turning in his mind, the weight of the moment settling over him. "I lost my hair years ago," she continued, her tone measured. "I had cancer. I went through chemotherapy, and while I beat the disease, the treatment left me with permanent alopecia." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, his expression unreadable. Jasmine pressed on, determined to finish what she had started. "I wear the wig because it makes things easier," she admitted. "But I'm tired of hiding. If we're going to build a life together, you need to know the truth." For a moment the silence was deafening. Then Ethan reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "Jasmine," he said, his voice steady, "thank you for telling me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't have to say anything right now," she said. "I just needed you to know." Ethan shook his head, his grip on her hands tightening. "What I need you to know is that this doesn't change how I feel about you," he said firmly. "You're still the woman I fell for, the woman I admire, respect, and care about. Hair or no hair, you're incredible." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. In the days that followed, Jasmine noticed a shift in her relationship with Ethan. Sharing her truth had brought them closer, their connection deepening in ways she hadn't anticipated. At work, Ethan began involving her more in key decisions, valuing her input not just as a colleague, but as a partner. Jasmine, in turn, found herself stepping into her role with newfound confidence, unburdened by the fear of being discovered. One afternoon, as they worked together in his office, Ethan looked up from his desk and said, "You should lead the next investor meeting." Jasmine blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Why not?" Ethan said with a grin. "You're the one who's been keeping this company on track. It's about time they see who's really running the show." Jasmine laughed, shaking her head. "You're too much." "I'm serious," Ethan said, his tone softening. "You're amazing, Jasmine, and it's time the world sees that too." Her heart swelled at his words, and she realized just how much she had grown, not just in her career, but in her sense of self. The day of the investor meeting arrived, and Jasmine stood at the front of the boardroom, her confidence radiating as she delivered a compelling presentation. Her words were clear and passionate, and by the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. Ethan watched from the back of the room, pride shining in his eyes. As Jasmine met his gaze, she felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had stood by her side through it all. That evening, they celebrated with a quiet dinner at Ethan's favorite rooftop restaurant. As they gazed out at the city lights, Ethan reached for her hand. "You're unstoppable," he said with a smile. Jasmine shook her head, her own smile soft. "Not without you," she said. Ethan's eyes darkened with emotion, and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. "You're everything I didn't know I needed," he murmured. Jasmine's heart swelled, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future filled with love, trust, and authenticity. As the weeks turned into months, Jasmine and Ethan's relationship grew stronger, their lives weaving together in ways neither of them had anticipated. Yet beneath the surface, Jasmine couldn't shake a lingering sense of uncertainty. Ethan's world was one of polished exteriors and high expectations. While he had embraced her truth without hesitation, Jasmine couldn't help but wonder how others in his circle might react. Would they see her as he did, or would they focus on what she lacked? One evening, as they prepared to attend a charity gala hosted by one of Ethan's business associates, Jasmine found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her wig, styled to perfection, framed her face, but it felt heavier than usual, as though it carried the weight of her insecurities. "Ready?" Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his tuxedo impeccable. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, forcing a smile. Ethan stepped closer, his hands settling on her shoulders. "You look stunning," he said, his eyes filled with admiration. Jasmine's smile softened, and she nodded. "Let's do this." The gala was a spectacle of luxury, with glittering chandeliers and an orchestra providing an elegant backdrop to the chatter of New York's elite. Jasmine felt the weight of curious gazes as she and Ethan entered the grand ballroom, his hand resting lightly on her back. He introduced her to colleagues and acquaintances, each interaction a delicate dance of pleasantries and veiled judgment. While most were polite, Jasmine couldn't ignore the occasional lingering looks or the subtle shifts in tone when they learned she wasn't a product of their world. As the evening wore on, Jasmine excused herself to get some air. She stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night breeze a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. "You okay?" Ethan's voice startled her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway. "Just needed a moment," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. "Did someone say something?" Jasmine shook her head. "No, it's not that. It's just hard sometimes, being part of your world. I don't always feel like I belong." Ethan's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hands in his. "You belong, Jasmine. Not because of who you know or where you come from, but because of who you are. Don't ever doubt that." His words brought a lump to her throat, and she nodded, grateful for his reassurance. Their bond faced its greatest test when an article surfaced in a prominent business magazine speculating about Ethan's relationship with Jasmine. While the piece was complimentary on the surface, it included a photo of Jasmine without her wig, a candid shot taken during a private moment she hadn't realized was being observed. The article's tone was subtle but cutting, suggesting that Ethan's choice of partner was unconventional for someone of his status. Jasmine discovered the article one morning while scrolling through her phone. Her heart sank as she read the words, the accompanying photo staring back at her like a taunt. When Ethan walked into the room, she handed him her phone without a word. He read the article, his expression darkening with each sentence. "This is ridiculous," he said finally, his voice tight with anger. Jasmine crossed her arms, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and resignation. "Is it?" Ethan turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Of course it is. This doesn't change anything." "It changes how people see me," she said quietly. "How they see us." "I don't care how they see us," Ethan said firmly. "What matters is how we see each other." Jasmine sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I wish it were that simple." "It is," Ethan said, stepping closer and cupping her face in his hands. "Let them talk, Jasmine. Let them judge. It doesn't matter because they don't know you like I do. They don't know how incredible you are." His words brought tears to her eyes, and she nodded, leaning into his touch. "Thank you," she whispered. "Always," Ethan replied. The fallout from the article was swift but short-lived. Ethan, true to his word, stood by Jasmine without hesitation, his unwavering support silencing most of the whispers. At his next public event, he addressed the situation directly. "Let me be clear," he said during his opening remarks. "My personal life is just that. Personal. But for those who feel entitled to comment on it, let me say this. I am proud to stand beside Jasmine Seraphine. She is smart, strong, and the best thing that's ever happened to me. If you can't see that, then you're the one who doesn't belong in my world." His words were met with applause, and Jasmine, watching from the wings, felt a swell of pride and love for the man who had chosen to fight for her. In the months that followed, Jasmine and Ethan continued to navigate the challenges of their relationship, their commitment to each other growing stronger with each obstacle they faced. Jasmine's confidence in herself blossomed, no longer tethered to the opinions of others. She embraced her authenticity with a grace that inspired those around her, becoming a role model not just in her personal life, but in her professional one as well. As for Ethan, he found a new sense of purpose in his role as both a father and a partner. He learned to let go of the need for control, trusting in the strength of the bonds he had built with Jasmine and Matthew. Together they forged a life that was imperfect but deeply fulfilling, a testament to the power of love, trust, and the courage to be unapologetically themselves. Months turned into a year, and Jasmine and Ethan's relationship continued to flourish. Their bond had withstood scrutiny, challenges, and self-doubt, emerging stronger than either had imagined possible. One crisp autumn evening, Ethan planned a surprise getaway to the countryside, a place where the skies were unpolluted by city lights and the air carried the scent of fallen leaves. They arrived at a secluded vineyard where a cozy private cabin awaited them. Jasmine, bundled in a soft scarf and sweater, couldn't hide her curiosity as Ethan led her through rows of grapevines lit by strings of twinkling lights. "What's all this?" she asked, her breath visible in the cool night air. "You'll see," Ethan said with a sly smile. At the end of the path, a small clearing opened up to reveal a table set for two. Candles flickered gently in the breeze, and a bottle of champagne rested in a bucket of ice. Jasmine gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Ethan, this is magical." "Only the best for you," he said, pulling out a chair for her. They enjoyed a leisurely dinner, reminiscing about their journey together, and dreaming about the future. When the meal ended, Ethan stood and extended a hand to Jasmine. "Dance with me," he said. Jasmine hesitated, then laughed. "There's no music," Ethan grinned. "We don't need any." She took his hand, and he led her into the clearing, swaying gently with her under the starlit sky. As they moved, Ethan's expression grew serious. He stopped, taking both of her hands in his. "Jasmine," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've changed my life in ways I didn't think were possible. You've shown me what it means to love and be loved, not for what the world sees, but for who we truly are." Jasmine's heart raced as he dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "You are my partner, my best friend, and the person I want to spend the rest of my life with," he said, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring. "Jasmine Seraphine, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Jasmine's cheeks as she nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." Ethan stood, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms. They kissed, the stars above bearing silent witness to the promise they had made. Months later, their wedding was a breathtaking affair, held in a sprawling meadow at sunset. Jasmine walked down the aisle, her head held high and her bare scalp shimmering like a crown of strength and triumph. Her dress was a vision of elegance, its simplicity highlighting her natural beauty. As she reached Ethan, his eyes filled with tears, his love for her written across his face. The ceremony was intimate and heartfelt, their vows a reflection of the journey they had traveled together. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was met with a thunderous applause from the family and friends who had gathered to celebrate their union. Jasmine and Ethan's life together was far from perfect, but it was real. They faced challenges with the same resilience and love that had carried them through their early days, building a life filled with laughter, growth, and unwavering support. Matthew thrived under their care, his bond with Jasmine deepening with each passing day. She became not just a stepmother, but a guiding light in his life, teaching him the value of authenticity and the strength found in vulnerability. Ethan, too, continued to grow, learning to balance his ambition with the needs of his family. Together they created a home that was warm, welcoming, and filled with love. Jasmine's career flourished as well. Inspired by her journey, she became an advocate for others facing similar challenges, using her platform to champion self-acceptance and inner strength. And though their story was far from over, Jasmine and Ethan knew they had already written its most important chapter, one of love, resilience, and the courage to be truly seen. Dear listener, life has a way of testing us, of pushing us to confront our fears and embrace our truths. Jasmine's story is a reminder that the most beautiful journeys are often the hardest ones, and that true love is not about perfection, but about acceptance. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, with every comment, like, and share, you're helping us spread a little more kindness in the world. Thank you for being part of our journey.